John, I'm so very happy to have you join me again. I think you and I have done this for 4 years in a row. We've jumped on and talked about things that are on our mind before the big show. And one of the things that's unique about this year is that we have so much energy around sports at NFT.NYC. And you're an internet pioneer. You have been for 4 decades. The things that you've done in sports, media, and technology is incredibly impressive. But for those that aren't familiar with you or your organization, maybe you could introduce yourself for a moment and let people know a bit about you, and then we'll jump in and have a fun conversation together.
Great. And Ian, it's fantastic to see you. It's always a highlight. And when we take a look over the 4 years, we'll talk about it, the growth of the event and what Jody and Cameron and their team have done, really amazing. So I've been in sports media for 4 decades. I worked at CBS Sports. During the Dream Team era, I ran broadcasting for the National Basketball Association. So for anybody out in the audience who watched the Michael Jordan doc, I was at most of those games. I worked at Sports Illustrated, and then for over 20 years, I was at ESPN, where for 15 of those, I ran digital media. So that's ESPN.com, the ESPN app, fantasy games, streaming, podcasting, direct to consumer. A fantastic opportunity if you love sports, media, and technology. I left ESPN in 2017 and I reunited with David Stern, the late NBA commissioner, who, after retiring from the NBA after 30 years, became a venture capitalist. And he and I worked together. We created a little company, which we called Micromanagement Ventures, which, if you remember, anyone who's familiar with David will get the humor of that. And we invested in 15 different sports tech startups, many of whom, like Whoop, the wearable, WSC Sports, many of them are very successful today. David had a cerebral hemorrhage, and sadly, he passed on New Year's Day of 2020. But I've continued that work of working with sports tech startups. And through my work, both after ESPN and before, I had gotten connected with Lou Kerner, who, as he's told me many times, found the crypto light in 2017. And through Lou, I got introduced to Cameron and Jody and got involved with the initial NFT.NYC conferences. And I'm fascinated by product development. Blockchain and crypto is the next level, next generation. The ability to create unique digital assets, to embed software and new capabilities within these assets is fascinating. And while we observe, the unbelievable sort of boom and bust of the industry and the speculation, the underlying technology and the creativity of people involved is staggering. That's not going anywhere. Certain projects may blow up, they may go down or whatever, but the underlying movement here around NFTs is phenomenal, global, and this year I think is going to be the most exciting by far, what Jody and Cameron and their teams are putting together.
Yeah, Jody and Cameron have done so much, and they've made such great decisions over the course of the last several years. When you and I first connected, it was before our first event. We did one of these conversations, and at that point, we talked a lot about ESPN and the transformation that ESPN went through from being a magazine and TV show to taking the plunge in the digital atmosphere. And in many ways, things have drastically not just grown, but changed and matured with the NFT industry since we started doing these events. What has been some experiences from a sports NFT focus? And what are some highlights over the last few years? I mean, obviously, it's easy for me to be like, well, Top Shots was a big highlight, but what are some highlights for you when you think about over the trajectory of the last several years? You've been involved with the community, you've been building, investing, doing things, and you've seen different moments for the sports. And so I just would love to get your insight on that.
So I remember the first couple of years, and it was just very conceptual, and people were were raising money, putting together different projects, but there were very few people using them. The user experience was very difficult. And it just seemed like, however interesting, it was going to take a long time. And I remember a couple of years ago seeing the demo for Zed Run, the horse racing NFT, and it was really exciting and interesting. And it spurred all of this creativity. And something that struck me as really powerful is it really is a connection of the sort of video games, 3D interactive community into sports and other stuff. So instead of just say watching the Kentucky Derby, as exciting as it might be, you could own a horse, you could race a horse, you could get involved in the upkeep of the horse, the promotion, all of these things that make it more interactive, more interesting, more fulfilling for people, as opposed to just the world that I grew up in, which is you would sit around and you'd watch a game for 3 hours. The game might be tremendously compelling, but increasingly audiences want to interact with whatever they're doing. So the first time I saw Zed Run, I was really so taken aback by it, just how interesting and compelling it was. And this also, and again, things can happen randomly, and they're unintended benefits or consequences. But in the U.S., the repeal of PASPA a couple of years ago and the legalization of sports betting on a state-by-state basis also created more interest in more projects within sports. And all of a sudden, betting, which is an international phenomenon, could be part of the experience that NFT entities are beginning to talk about. Something like horse racing, sort of a dormant sport in the US, could be reborn in this capacity. Then during COVID, the debut and explosion of Dapper Labs and NBA Top Shot probably for the sports industry was the breakthrough moment. And what struck me there was the elegance and ease of use of the experience that Dapper Labs created. You didn't have to, like as Steve Jobs would say, they sort of abstracted out. You didn't have to understand what blockchain was. You didn't have to understand what a hot wallet was. You could do it on a credit card. And the product itself, the NFT video highlights, were beautifully composed and done, an aspirational product. The timing was perfect between people being at home, getting their stimulation checks. And it was also a breakthrough in that the players themselves, the NBA players themselves, became collectors, got interested, got involved. And that had another sort of dynamic impact on the whole thing. Hadn't seen that before. I told a friend that growing up in New York City, my parents would take me to Bat Day at Yankee Stadium, and I would get a bat for Reggie Jackson or one of the Yankee stars at the time. And I'd be so excited. I'd come home and I'd look at the bat. Within 2 days, it was stuck in my closet, never to be looked at again. So the idea that we could carry a collectible on our phone, that maybe we could have fractional ownership, or that software rules could be written that it could be enhanced. All of a sudden, you saw with Top Shot the first sort of real iteration of that. And of course, because of NBA Top Shot, every other big league wanted its own type of product. We've seen the growth of Socios with international soccer, and the concept of creating membership where fans can help select the music that their team comes out with, or the socks they wear, or other things. Again, interactivity. One of the first years we had Nicholas Julia from So Rare, and he was talking about the concept of a sort of blockchain fantasy game built around soccer. It sounded great, but what they actually created was even better. And they've raised a stupendous amount of money. They've hired a former ESPN colleague named Ryan Spoon, who's now their US CEO, and they're off to the races. And all of a sudden, fantasy games, which was a big part of the business at ESPN, is going to be reborn for crypto and the blockchain, and reborn on an international basis. So Rare has really gotten going with international soccer. But just this week, they signed a huge deal with Major League Baseball. And that's a topic that we're hopeful of getting into, both with So Rare and with MLB at NFT.NYC in June.
So, I mean, it could be argued that NBA or Dapper had more to do with the success of Top Shot, but I would propose that it was an interdependent approach, that Dapper couldn't have done it without NBA's brand, and the NBA couldn't do it without Dapper's innovation. And so it's a great example.
Totally agree with you.
These two completely different worlds colliding and creating this spark in the industry. What does that make you feel about collaboration when it comes to tech companies, strategists, consultants, the builders, and then the biggest brands in the world, in the sports world? Because we've only scratched the surface. We haven't even really started yet compared to where things are going. So when you think of collaboration, the major league teams or leagues, and you think of the big tech firms, and as you just mentioned with Super Rare, what are your thoughts in terms of how can collaboration be done best? And what are maybe some landmines that you've either seen people step on or are just concerned about folks not being aware of the types of things they need to be mindful of when they're collaborating to create innovative projects?
So I think it starts with the people themselves, right? You had visionary leadership at Dapper Labs, Richard Roham and Katie, as well as the people at the NBA, who took a look. I've always subscribed to the easy button theory, which is that you're best served trying to make sure that your concept, your communication is easy to follow. I've been in lots of meetings with people where people will go through complicated concepts. And the people in the room will nod their head. And you realize that they don't understand at all what's being discussed. They're just trying to nod their head and try to seem agreeable and then get out of the room. So I think it's incumbent upon entrepreneurs and people pioneering new technologies to try to explain why this is valuable for the person, for whom they're trying to make the deal or trying to acquire rights. And one thing, just the NFT.NYC, I've noticed in some of the applications is we're going to be doing more how-tos this year, how to pitch your idea, how to hire, and not necessarily assume that everybody understands all these things. So you can, especially with some of the user experience that were involved in crypto projects that got started, when you and I first started working, they were hopelessly complicated and made it very, very difficult for anybody to sign up. That had to be radically simplified. And I think it starts with people's communication with each other. You can't assume that everybody understands the vernacular. You can't assume that when you send an invitation to the Discord server, that everyone's doing that all the time or understands what it is that they should be doing or getting out of that. And then I think it's incumbent upon the progressive leaders of established organizations to be open to things that are new and different, that might break, that might have problems or whatever. We've certainly benefited from a lot of freedom provided to the internet, which wound up, enabling the internet to become the presence that it is today. The same thing is true of these sort of Web3 projects. You need to have patience. Not all of them are going to work. And frankly, I think COVID has been a little bit of a pull through. Some of these things have happened faster than I imagined they would. But I think it comes back to the people being willing to take time to communicate what you're trying to get done. And then on the part of the people who are potentially making deals with crypto firms, being open to things that are different or that you might not understand. In the case of Top Shot, for instance, I think you really did see the best of both organizations. And that's why I think the project was so successful. Meaning, the NBA really embraced it, and Dapper gave them, they had worked out a lot of the issues with CryptoKitties, but they gave them a fantastic sort of launch pad here. And I think we're going to see the creation of new products in so many different categories, collectibles, ticketing, betting, gaming, sponsorships. that it's really incumbent upon both sides to be open to each other to really realize the opportunity that collectively we have.
What do you think's missing? Like, what are you surprised hasn't been developed in the Web3 sports world? What are you waiting for? What are you anticipating seeing at NFT.NYC in June, or at least in 2023? What's ripe to be developed in this collaboration?
So a colleague, Asher Weiss, has an interesting company called Tixology, which is doing blockchain ticketing. And there are lots of blockchain ticketing concepts, but that's one that I feel is inevitable. And it just makes so much sense, right? Your ticket could become a collectible. Your ticket could become part of the sort of fan relationship management sources at leagues and teams. We could embed the software with highlights and with new things. And once the model exists for sports, it could exist for music festivals and any other things. The issues get to the technical complexity of dealing with throughput of tickets, how you handle bots and other problems in that industry. So it's not trivial. It'll take time to work out. But the idea that my ticket could be more than a ticket, that it could be part of sort of a digital scrapbook that I put together, that it could trigger membership either with a team or a musician, just seems to me like it's so ripe for opportunity. As to whether Asher and his company can realize that, we shall see. But that's one that I think is super interesting, a big win potentially for everybody. It's going to take a little while to do it. But I'd be very surprised if, and hopefully you and I are doing this in a few years, let's say 5 years down the road, I'd be very surprised if we're doing this and that's not the way we do tickets. But it's not the way we do tickets today.
So on that regard, and maybe we'll be wrapping our conversation. So maybe this is kind of a landing point. When you talk about this should be happening for sure in 5 years, when you and your peers think through NFT development, and when you're talking about it or planning it out, how often are you thinking about this season and this year versus this decade and this century? And when you think about the leaders of the industry, what would you like to see their perspective be and why? Because there's all sorts of advantages for being thoughtful of this year, and the advantages don't come for a while when you think of a century. So I'd love your insight on how people view things and what their trajectory is of goals and of ambitions, and how that maybe paces things out for more long-term success.
So I would just say, and this is a big difference with this conference today versus when we started, is typically you're seeing people talking about both. You're seeing people about getting to work on things right now, as well as in the next few years. Some of the breakthroughs, I believe, require systems to be better and to have things fixed that are problems today. There's lots of dissatisfaction in the industry about gas fees and any number of other things. These are problems, complicated, complex problems that I believe will be solved. I'm not positive exactly who's going to solve them. I'm not positive when they're going to get solved, but I think that they will be solved because there's so much money being invested. There's so many bright people being involved. And it's important, especially with the financial climate, very tumultuous at the moment. It's important not just to be a dreamer, but to be a realist, to be somebody saying, we're building this because there's a real need and desire for it. Yes, there are complicated problems, but we're going to solve them, but we're going to create something new and bigger now. And so I feel like people should not overpromise. On the other hand, the history of technology shows that complicated problems do get solved. And we're dealing with those today, and they're frustrating and difficult, but I think we're going to make progress. And I'm sure you would agree with me. It's amazing to look at just the progress just in a couple of years. It's astounding, inspiring. So we got tons and tons of work to do, but if the progress we've seen is any indication, we should be enthusiastic and optimistic, I believe.
I agree with you completely. Well, let's land it here. Let's talk about merch for a second. Anytime you go to a sports stadium, if you're aware and you pause for a moment, you're going to realize that this team and this league is maybe best at selling merchandise. And we've seen that play out to a great extent over the last decade. Do you anticipate that in the metaverse, whether people are walking through this one or that one, do you anticipate that merch from the sports world is going to be as significant of a play as it is in the physical world? Do you think people are going to be walking around Sandbox and Decentraland with their hats and their shirts and their and how do you see that playing out? Because it's a big part of the sports industry.
It's a great point, and I believe it's going to be huge. And not only is it be huge that you're going to have, and we're already seeing startups, you're going to have designers creating outfits literally only for the metaverse. The winners in the metaverse, I believe, are going to be those who can create these scale interoperable, interoperable areas and communities. It's possible, say, Epic Games with the Unreal Engine could do that. It's possible Roblox could do that. Obviously, that's a direction that Facebook is going. But this idea that our sort of costumes, our outfits can travel with us to different places it's definitely going to happen. When I was a kid, the Oakland Athletics had a white Sunday uniform. They would play in white every Sunday.
I remember that.
I was always mesmerized when I saw it. And that's just the tip of the iceberg as to where we're going. So for those fans who are going to watch the NBA playoffs, over the next few weeks, you might wear your Celtics or Bucks shirt when you're watching the game, but increasingly in a virtual environment, you're going to want that same thing. So I think that business, similar to virtual goods in video games, is going to be just huge. That's an example. We don't necessarily have that many examples, I think, of that for NFT.NYC 2022, but it's something to look forward to in 2023. It's a great point.
Well, there's a lot to look forward to. I look forward to your involvement with our event, really your event, John. It's a community event, and you've been a part of it since idea and conception, as you mentioned, Jody and Cam reaching out to you. So thank you for being an integral part of what has been built. Really looking forward to hearing you speak at the event this year, June 20th through the 23rd. For folks watching John and my conversation, thanks for your attention. We recognize that you're there, and we hope to see you in New York City for NFT.NYC. John, I salute you, my friend.
I salute you, Ian. Thank you. Okay. Take care. Be well. I'll see you.